recording now.
Yep, you got it. Thanks.
All right, so what I want to cover today is kind of a broad topic, but I think a very interesting one and a very consequential one. Namely, the invention of the technology of music notation in the Middle Ages, one of the great intellectual accomplishments of that era in history. So I want to begin with this guy here on the right. This is Saint Isidore of Seville. He was a bishop in the 6th or maybe 7th centuries in Spain. And he rather famously sort of codified in this encyclopedic way all of the learning of his day, including a lot of what the early Middle Ages had inherited from classical Greece and Rome. And he gathered all of this in his great work, which is called the Etymologies. And in it, he discusses all the kind of different branches of learning and arts. And I want to focus on what he says about music. He has a lot of really interesting things to say about music, but in particular, he talks about how music has this connection to the muses, and the muses are the daughters of memory. And he says that this is fitting for music for this reason. Whence came the invention of the poets that the muses are the daughters of Jupiter and memory? For unless sounds are held by the memory of man, they perish because they cannot be written down. That is to say, when you listen to a piece of music or when you sing a piece of music, it exists in the moment, and then after that it's gone. And the only place where it exists after it's done being sung is in your memory. It's not something that was possible to write down using the technology available to Saint Isidore in the 6th and 7th centuries. Okay, well, this is a little bit of a problem because in particular, it's a problem with relation to the Roman liturgy, because music, as you probably all know, is entirely central to the execution of that liturgy, right? So the Mass and the Divine Office, but I'm going to focus for now on the Mass because it's probably more familiar and more part of our daily lives nowadays for most Christians. The Mass has music as one of its core features, and it has ever since the beginning, right? So if you look at the gospel accounts of the Last Supper, they sang, after the supper was ended, they sang a hymn, and then they went away into the Garden of Gethsemane. So music has always been kind of a crucial feature of the liturgy. But what kind of music? Well, we don't actually have a really great record of what, the music would have been like in the early centuries of the church. We can guess based on, liturgical practice of ancient Judaism that they would have been singing one of the Hallel Psalms, which was part of the kind of Passover liturgy of the time. But what about all those centuries after? We just get little glimpses here and there of what the music was like. So I just want to look for a second at the great autobiography of Saint Augustine, because Augustine actually has lots of interesting things to say about music as well. Before he wrote the Confessions, he also actually wrote an entire book about music, which is not about music in the sense that we think about it mostly. It's primarily about poetry and the rhythm of poetry and poetic meter. And it's a pretty involved theory of meter. But in the Confessions, he mentions music in a couple places. So here's one. This is right after his conversion. So this is in book 8 of the Confessions. And you probably know that he was brought into the church by St. Ambrose, who was the Bishop of Milan at the time. He says, the church in Milan had only recently begun to, let me back up just a little bit. Okay, so he was baptized. And he says, in those days, I could not have enough of the wonderful sweetness of meditating on the depth of your plan for the salvation of the human race. How I wept as your hymns and songs were sung, cut to the quick by the voices of your church lifted up in sweet music. Those voices flooded my ears, and your truth poured forth as a clear stream into my heart, welling up into passionate devotion. The tears flowed, and it was good for me that they did. So as he was being baptized, he's listening to singing in the church. It seems to be pretty apparent. Then he continues, the church in Milan had only recently begun to employ this form of comfort and encouragement, that is, music in the liturgy. The brethren lifted up their voices together with great enthusiasm. It had been a year or not much longer since Justina, mother of the boy king Valentinian, was persecuting your man Ambrose in the interest of her heresy. She had been led astray by the Arians. Okay, I won't get off on that tangent. The devout congregation kept watch in your church, prepared to die with their bishop, your servant. My mother, your handmaid, was there, foremost among them, all in her care and watchfulness, fully alive with her prayers. We were still cold, untouched by the heat of your spirit, but we were excited by the chaos and disturbance in the city. At that time, the singing of hymns and psalms in the manner of the Eastern churches was introduced, so that people would not grow faint from sorrow and fatigue. This practice has been kept up from that time until today, and many, perhaps nearly all of your flocks throughout the world now do likewise. So for Augustine, the purpose of music at the services of the church is to prevent tedium. It would be tedious to go through the entire book of Psalms in prayer as a kind of a liturgical congregation without having music to kind of sweeten the deal. So I like that way of thinking about it. But again, this is not particularly specific. We don't know a whole lot about what that music would have sounded like. If you know anything about kind of esoteric liturgical things, you probably know that the church in Milan has always had its kind of own tradition of liturgy, which is now called the Ambrosian Rite, named after this very same Saint Ambrose. And they have their own chants, and they're different from the chants that are sung everywhere else in the Western church. But were these the things that Augustine was hearing being sung in the 5th century? We have no way of knowing, because none of it could be written down. So this was a problem that really became more and more of a problem as Christianity became a Europe-wide phenomenon, as Christianity became the religion of Christendom, of Europe. And so the problem kind of came to a head under Charlemagne. So in the Frankish kingdoms, once the Franks sort of became Christians, there was a great desire to make the liturgy the same all through Western Europe. So the liturgy of Rome was seen, as for obvious reasons, as the one to be imitated, the one that all other local churches in Europe should adopt the practices of. And so under Charlemagne, there was a great push to have standardization in the Western liturgy. And it's really that standardization that has given us the Latin Rite as we have it now, the rite that's still done in every church that's descends from Western Christianity. So one of the sort of problems that emerge is that it became quite urgent to be able to write down features of the liturgy and then share them from place to place. So obviously, it would be a great advantage to be able to write down the music that was sung in the liturgy and then to transmit it to another place without having to have your entire establishment of singing canons and monks move with you. So if you're, some Frankish lord and you want to have your church, with your own handpicked bishop doing the liturgy properly as it was done in Rome, you wouldn't want to have to bring a bunch of people from Rome in order to make that happen. It would be much better if you could just import the liturgical books and get it done that way. So the Isidore's sort of conundrum of how music can't be written down became really an urgent question. So there are, beginning in the 9th century and then accelerating for a few hundred years after that, many attempts to write down music. And some of them are quite interesting and unusual. So here's a pretty early example. This is a book of how to chant segments of the psalm. And you'll notice what they've done. You can see there's a Latin text, and the text is printed on this kind of grid. There's a series of lines, and it sort of looks like a piece of ruled paper or something. And the text sort of moves along and it jumps from line to line. And then when it moves from line to line, just to help you figure out what's going on, there's this little, diagonal thing in red that shows, where you're supposed to move next. So this text says, nos qui vivimus, and this is all, abbreviated in the usual way. Benedicimus Dominum, ex hoc nunc, et usque in seculum. And the main voice is shown in black, but then you have these other voices doubling kind of in parallel. And I can't do that by myself, but I can sing this, and you could just follow along with the words and sort of figure it out, right? Nos qui vivimus benedicimus Dominum, ex hoc nunc et usque in seculum. It's got this sort of, the shape of it makes some sense. The notes are given these weird symbols along the left-hand side, which tell you what notes you're supposed to sing. But other than that, it's a fairly reasonable and ingenious system, but it's not the one that became what we use now. So this is kind of a dead end, technologically speaking, because this isn't the one that became widespread. It has a few issues. It's difficult to read the text because the text is jumping around from place to place. It takes up rather a lot of space, right? Think about what portion of this page you need just to write a fairly simple little melody like a psalm tone. I mean, imagine if you wanted to write a whole graduale or a whole book that contained everything for the whole year in this notation. It would be a massive waste of parchment, more or less. And it's just a little funny looking with the little zigzagging lines. So I think those are probably decent enough reasons why it kind of died out. And instead, what we got is something called neumes. So here's a little bit of 10th century, I don't know if you want to call it propaganda or just, art that shows what's what the purpose of the book is. But this is a little excerpt from a book we'll be looking at in just a second. But you can probably tell who this is. This is Saint Gregory, one of the two saints most associated with music, because he was considered to have established the repertoire of chant. And here's the Holy Ghost, presumably, singing the chant into Gregory's ear, and then Gregory is dictating it to his scribe, and then, miracle of miracles, it's being written down using these little squiggles. And now we're recording this music that was previously incapable of being written down. So this is kind of a big deal, because this is the system that became our modern system. This is what we sing from when we do any music nowadays, although it has changed, as you can probably tell, it's changed a little bit from the way it looked in the 10th century. So let me just explain the kind of basics of it. I'm going to have to share a different screen so that I can do this. So here's a little hymn text. It's got a melody that everyone would have known in the Middle Ages who was a monk or a religious. It's a famous hymn from the feast of St. John the Baptist. And it sounds a bit like this. Utque ant laxis resonare fibris. I'll skip the rest for now. But let's say that I wanted to remember what that sounded like. Well, I would have to go like this. I think, well, it starts on a pretty low note. So I'll just write a little symbol like that to show a low note. And then let's see, it goes up from there. Ut, que, ant. Que and ant are both higher than the notes that precede them. So I'll write them with a little up pointing line. And then on laxis, the la of laxis has two notes. Ut, que, ant, laxis. And the notes go low, high, la. And so to do that, well, I could make two strokes with my pen, right? I'm just extending the idea that each pen stroke represents a note. The low note is a kind of cross stroke like that, and then the high note is a kind of up pointing stroke. Well, so to do that, I'll just combine them into one, and I'll get something that looks like that. It's a downward stroke, and then it turns up. And that captures, for me, that it has, it goes low, high. And then I could do something like, let's see, that for the xis to show, yeah, then it goes down at the end. Utque ant laxis. And then I put a little tick mark on the end of the neum to tell me to hold it longer, And that's, this is basically the system they do. And we don't have time to do a whole lot more than that. But I want to look at some medieval examples now that you have the kind of basics of how that works. So here's, this is the gradual for Maundy Thursday. So if you went to Holy Week masses for the Triduum preceding Easter, you very well might have heard this. Christus factus est pro nobis obediens. I'll just sing up to that part. And notice that there's your swoosh, so that's a two-note little neum. And then there's your low note. That's the kind of sideways looking one. Here's another two-note neum. And so I can look at this and sing it. Christus factus est pro nobis, obedienzusque ad mortem. I can sing that, right? I can just read it from this and make some sense of it. And it's a beautiful and extremely elegant system. There are all kinds of little nuances, right? So the first two-note neum, this little Nike swoosh looking thing, the down up, that's drawn very quickly, right? It's a down up. You can tell just by looking at it that the pen went down and up very quickly. Here's the same neum, but look, the scribe clearly paused a little bit after the down portion of the note and then made a really decisive turn to go up. And what we think that means is that this one takes longer than the other one. So this is a fast down up, and this one's like a down up that's more deliberate. Okay, and then sometimes they have these little tick marks on them, and that's also a sign that you want to lengthen that sort of thing. And then sometimes they draw little letters. So here's the letter C, and C stands for celeriter, or quickly. So we're meant to sing that part quickly. So there are all kinds of beautiful little expressive aspects to this system. And so I can look at this and I love singing from these neumes because they're so rich in expressivity. There's one problem, which is that if you don't know the melody, this does you no good. Okay, so I already know how the tune goes because I've been singing it every year for the last 20 years. And if I didn't know that, there's not enough information here to reconstruct it. There's some information, there's a lot of valuable information. But if I'm that, lord in Frankish Germany or whatever, and I want to bring in the Roman liturgy, I would still need someone to come interpret this. You could import this book, but you still need someone who actually knows the melodies to come teach them. So that's where the next stage in, here's some more examples of neumes with of course, beautiful initials. This is the very beginning of the book. This is the introit for the first Sunday of Advent, ad te levavi. So of course it gets, extremely beautiful initial A. So there were various systems to try to make the notation more specific, right? One of them, here's that same ad te levavi. Yeah, well, let's take a look at this for a second. So this tune goes, and here the neumes are tiny because they have to fit above these enormous letters. Ad te levavi, anima meam, Deus meus, etc. But again, the problem is it's not specific enough. So here's an example. This is from the Montpellier Codex, which was rediscovered in the mid-19th century. Here's the text, ad te levavi anima meam. Here are the neumes up at the top. And then in between are the names of the notes. So now it is specific, right? Now I've got the neume to tell me what to sing. I've got the word to tell me what word to sing. And then I've got the notes to tell me what notes to sing. G, D, F, G, H, H, G. Now, in modern music, we only go up to G because this note that they're calling H, we think of as A. kind of repeated. And I won't get into the details of that. They just go all the way up the alphabet, which is kind of fun. So if you read modern music, this will stop making sense to you when you get to the high K and stuff. But it's still kind of cool. But this is more, it's got more stuff, because this does tell me what notes I could sing. If I know how to read this, I don't need to bring a person in to teach me, right? Now we're going to improve on this, because this has 3 streams of information. I have to read the neumes on the top. I have to read the note names here, and then I've got to read the text below, and I have to do all that at the same time. The improvement that finally solves this problem is usually attributed to this guy. This is Guido from Arezzo, who is a monk who lived at the end of the 11th century. And his solution is this. And I won't get into too many more details because we're about out of time. But here we have the same neumes, the same expressive shapes, but I have these lines. And the lines tell me note names, F, A, C, and E. The F line is red, the yellow line is C, and then we have to just sort of imagine the A and the E lines. If they were ever there, they're extremely faint now. But now, look, I can just read the neume and the words, and I don't need to look at the letter names because they're all there, and I get all the expressive characters of the neumes. And without ever having learned this, I could look at this and sing, Puer natus est nobis. These are 2-note descending, high, low. You can see the same, the system is very simple in its basic outlines. So now with this invention of the musical staff, I can transmit musical information without having to have a person to teach it. So there are all other kinds of, here's an example of, and of course this is Easter. So Easter also gets, a beautiful initial. There are all kinds of more details to go into with the ways they actually learned to sing. But this in its essence is the technology that became modern music notation. If you ever studied an instrument in school, or if you ever sang in choirs, even if you're not doing Gregorian chant, you probably read from a musical staff that had lines and spaces, and then the notes could be on the line or in the space. That was a feature that didn't exist in those older versions. And these neumes, well, when the pens changed from the pens they were using in the Middle Ages to the more Gothic pen of the High Middle Ages, these neumes just became kind of more square and blocky and something more like the notes that we look at now. But other than that, not a whole lot has changed in the basic technology, which is that you write the words and you write the notes above on a staff. You don't try to write the words on a staff. You don't try to zigzag around with the words. You have this kind of 2-layer system, and that's the one that's stuck. So it's still the basis for all music notation today. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and hope you enjoyed it. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Charlie. That's fascinating. That was really, really fascinating. Does anyone, you can unmute yourself if you have questions. I don't see anybody in the chat feature, so just feel free to unmute yourself and ask away any questions you have for Mr. Weaver. Oh, now I can see everybody. Don't be shy. Jill, it looked like you were raising your hand, but I think you're just scratching your head.
Okay, I just unmuted myself, Kim. This is Mary.
Yeah, Mary, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I can't unvideo myself
That's okay. No worries.
at that stage of the evening.
No worries.
Charlie, I met you and Elizabeth when we were at St. Mary's. When you say this is how they would be, I think, taught music or read music, would that from beginning on be something children would have been able to understand those notations? Or what sort of age would you say would understand what you just showed us?
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. It was the very first thing you learned as a kid, if you were intending to pursue a career in the church. Along with literacy came musical literacy. And Guido, who is often credited with inventing the staff, although that's a little hazy, we do know that he definitely invented systems for children to learn to sight sing. And so he invented the solfege syllables. For him, they were ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, based on that hymn of John the Baptist that I mentioned. But nowadays we say do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, because do is a little easier to sing. But the basic idea is the same. And what he says in his book describing it, that is that up until now, it's taken years and years to learn to sing chant, because you have to the only way they could study it was just with repetition and absorbing it that way. So if you joined a monastery, it was probably many years before you got to be completely competent at singing the chant. And he says what the advantage of his system is that you can teach it to a child in almost no time. And the idea is that they learn to sing at sight using his sort of pattern recognition. It's actually his pedagogy is really interesting and involves recognizing recurring patterns and then being able to identify them and then sing them off the page. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, this was something that was taught from a very early age, and that, I mean, obviously, music literacy wasn't extremely widespread in the Middle Ages, but neither was regular literacy. But the two did often go hand in hand. So if you were a cleric, for sure, you would learn how to do this quite early on in your education.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, anyone else have questions?
Yeah,
Jill, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. This is a really very interesting. Thank you for being here. I'm just wondering, it seems remarkable to me that, what did you say, Guido of Arezzo is the man, but you know, were there other competing forms, or were there a lot of different ways of notating music? And then how did this one become a prevalent form?
Yeah, this, from early on, it coexisted with the sort of word one, but it seems to have caught on like wildfire in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. And then basically after that, it becomes the only form. And as to how that happened, it's hard to know, other than maybe his claims were true, right? So what he says in his books is that I can take this thing that used to be extremely time consuming and onerous and make it easy. And part of that is being able to write down the music in a way that makes sense to people and that they can then get off the page. So I guess my best answer to that is that he was probably correct about that. It really did seem to work well, and so caught on for that reason. But it was tied up with his whole, I can share just one more thing. He took the notes and he arranged them in this famous pattern on his hand. So each joint on each finger represents one pitch in the musical system. And you know, one thing that you would do as you would sing was to tie the notes you're singing and looking at on the page with a particular place on your hand. And so I know as teachers, a lot of us know if you can sort of add this kinesthetic dimension to something, it's often helpful with learning.
Mhm.
So as you're singing, you're sort of learning this map of the notes, and then you're sort of navigating it. There are all kinds of interesting things about this. It goes in a spiral. So the lowest note's at the tip of the thumb, and then it sort of spirals around, and then all the fingertips, and then it circles back here, and then it jumps to the fingernail on the back of the middle finger. But all of those things you can point out with one hand. So as you're instructing a choir, you can use your thumb to point at all the joints, and then you can use your index finger to point at the joints of the thumb. So you have a kind of simple one-handed way to memorize these notes. And apparently this worked. And I think what I've been working on is trying to do more of this practice, because this was how music was taught. This was the first thing you learned in Catholic school from around the year 1100 to around the year 1850, if you'll believe it. And so I've been trying to sort of look into reviving that and thinking, well, people tend to look at this and think, this is just crazy. There's no way you could remember all this. This just seems really illogical. And what I like to point out, oh, here's a sort of better, simpler drawing of it that I made. You actually have, the QWERTY keyboard pretty much mapped onto your hand in this way. Here's what your left hand would type on a QWERTY keyboard. And you probably don't even think about it. And it's because no one held up to you a map of the hand and said, here's where all the keys are on the keyboard. Memorize this and prosper. No, instead you start with the home position, right? You start with the four you need the most, and maybe a couple more. Guido tended to use 6, but you just do this, and maybe you do this for a whole year, but eventually you can sort of you build this sort of system. So yeah, anyway, I know that's a bit of a tangent, but it became the way that music was taught in Catholic Europe for hundreds of years. So Verdi, this would have been how Verdi learned first. This would have been how Haydn and Mozart learned first. It would have been even how Puccini learned first. So it really was kind of central to music education for a long time. And all that goes back to Guido. So that the hand is called the Guidonian hand, and it's still, somewhat famous for that.
Wow. Okay, any other questions for Charlie? Okay, going once. Going twice. All right. Thanks so much, Charlie, and thank you everybody for coming out. We have 2 more Teachable Thursdays in our series, so come back 2 weeks from now and have a good evening. Good night.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.